Nobody Axed You by John Brunner. Originally published in the May 1965 issue of New Worlds magazine and republished in the May 1971 issue of a French magazine called Fiction. It appeared in two anthologies, SF Reprise 5 in 1966 and The Best SF Stories from New Worlds in 1967, then in two collections of the author's stories, Time Jump in 1973 and a German one in 1976. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Nobody Axed You. I felt so detached and critical it was almost as though I were watching someone else chopping open Denise's head. That was a knack I'd acquired through long experience. Detached or not, though, I felt elated. This was good. This was the most wonderful thing I'd ever done. I could feel the hot, sweat-slippery handle of the hatchet threatening to slip from my grasp as I swung it again and again. I could feel the slimy stickiness of blood on my hands. It sprayed all over my shirt and jacket and made the synfab stick to my chest. I could smell its sickly scent. Fabulous. She was dead. There could be no doubt. Probably the first swing of the hatchet would have been enough, but I had to make sure. Then the next step would be to dismember her and put her in the disposal tube before anyone came in. "Gardner, where the hell are you? Gardner? Say, have you seen Gene Gardner anywhere?" I sighed and switched off the run-back machine. The picture hesitated and froze at a frame showing me bending over Denise's body prior to taking off the legs. I remembered that was where I'd hesitated when actually recording the scene, because the lab had done a magnificent job with the dummy, and those legs were so exactly like Denise's, I'd had a momentary qualm. But it hadn't spoiled the total effect. I put the lights up and got out of my seat, the middle one in the row. Blast Bossman Crane for interrupting. But when he shouted in that voice, making the whole building shake, it wasn't good to make him wait around. I slid the door back in its grooves. There he was on the stairs, puffing and panting and glowering, his mock cigar jutting up at a warning angle. Behind him, his two secretaries. As an affectation, he had identical twins, both blonde, both beautiful, hovered with recorders at the ready, while all about him the leisure time shifters huddled against the wall and the balusters, trying to give him more room than there was. "Looking for me, Mr. Crane?" I called. "Might have guessed," he barked. "Damn narcissist!" He came charging up the steps, thrust past me into the run-back room, and stopped as though a brake had been applied by remote control. "And on your own, too," he grunted. "On your own." His tone was indictment and sentence combined. "The hell?" I said, nettled. I pointed to a shrouded heap on the floor behind the seats. "What's that?" Crane demanded. The heap moved irregularly, then seemed to become aware of the situation and froze. "A couple of leisure time shifters got married today," I explained. "Asked could they honeymoon in here under that cover. I said why not, provided they kept decently quiet." "Well, the honeymoon's over," Crane snapped. "I want to talk with you in private. Get 'em out of here," he added to the nearer of his secretaries. She exchanged a glance with her sister, and they both blushed. As a matter of principle, of course, Crane's personal staff and most of the front people of the organization at least pretended to be frigid. In the girls' case, it wasn't pretense. On the fiery red of their cheeks, the girls' F symbols stood out vividly. "Ah, hell," Crane said, realizing. He gave the honeymoon couple a prod with his toe. "Back to the stairs, you, and thank Mr. Gardner for letting you in here, why don't you?" Sheepishly, they emerged from under the cover, fastening zips and so on. The girl was rather pretty, I thought. I couldn't call her beautiful and mean it, though. Denise was so staggeringly lovely, I was getting into the habit of reserving that category just for her. The couple muttered obedient thanks and left. A ribald chorus of congratulations walled up outside before one of the secretaries could get to the door and slam it. "Why in hell don't you make things more difficult for 'em instead of easier?" Crane sighed. "Ah, well, we all have our lapses, and a weakness for romance isn't cured in a day." He dropped into the middle seat facing the screen, the good one where I'd been sitting, and jabbed his mock cigar towards the frozen picture. "If I didn't know you better, Gene," he said, "I could hope you were running through that stinker to find out what was wrong with it, but I guess you were basking in your own brilliance, as usual." I stared at him. It wasn't a joke. Crane had a special ponderous tone for jokes, like an elephant dancing. "Stinker?" I echoed. "Now look here, boss man. Have you heard the DOA rating on that show yet?" He cut in. I hesitated. I hadn't, in fact. I had no reason to think it had fallen below standard, though. Did Crane's outburst mean there had been some catastrophic drop in the DOAs? I hadn't answered before he drew his mouth up in a sneer. "Not worried about the figures anymore, eh? Play back the rating for him, you two." The girls, their faces pale and calm as usual, the F symbols barely discernible on their pinky skin, took station about 5 feet apart on either side of the screen, for stereo, of course, and at a nod from Crane switched their recorders on. The voice of Judd Logan, the DOA rating expert, rang out. "This week, the Gene Gardner Show to Kill Time rated 860 dead on arrival within 48 hours of airing. Weekly average since this time a year back, 721.4. This week's subject, axe murder." The recorders clicked off. Relieved but still puzzled, I rounded on Crane. "What's wrong with that?" I demanded. "It's up on last week. It's over the year's average. It always is. Show me anyone who gets a better DOA every week on the week." He wasn't in a reasonable mood. He clamped the mock cigar back in his mouth. "You know how much the population of the city area went up in those same 12 months? 480,000. Have you been out and about recently? Have you tried to get about? Or have you been sitting admiring yourself in Runback?" Admiring myself? That be damned, boss man. You want I should take myself to Lancaster, maybe? His top DOA rating for any network show is 90 or 100 below mine. Who dreams up these shows? Who keeps them ahead of the field week in and week out? I do. Doing better than anyone else in the business. That makes it a crime not to cure the problem single-handed. He wilted. I was glad. I had a recurrent nightmare in which he actually told me to go back to Harold Lancaster at our biggest rival network. He was still a better boss than Lancaster had ever been to me when I was serving my apprenticeship before I rated star billing, let alone my own show. So, to keep him sweet, I dropped the pressure. Okay, points made on both sides. Of course the show isn't perfect. I hope it never will be, because improving it is what gives me the zest to keep it rolling 48 weeks in the year. But I'm always willing to listen to outside ideas, you know. Why don't you and I and the girls sit down and watch this one you called a stinker, clear through from the start, and see if we can brainstorm a few new slants? He sighed. "I've seen it 4 times already, but I guess I can stand another dose. Come where you can see, you two," he added to the secretaries. I triggered the chair arm switch and ran the recording back to the main title at the beginning. "I'll keep the sound down," I said, "and I'll stop it occasionally to explain the thinking behind a particular episode, right? Now, is there anything you don't like about the main title? You see, we have my name in white and the initial S of the title itself, and then the word time. Everything else is in blood red, so it stands out. Show to kill time." One of the girls ventured, "Couldn't you hold the red lettering by itself after the white has faded so there's no room for mistake?" "It's an idea," I agreed. I'll ask the psychologist on the script team. He may say that having "how to kill" on the screen by itself is overdoing it, but I'm always open to well-meant suggestions. After all, who has a bigger interest in the show's success than I have? The girls chuckled in unison. If it hadn't been for Denise, I'd have been very interested to find out how accurate their F symbols were. I went on commentating on the show, explaining how the dialogue was checked with word and phrase frequency lists published by a reliable research outfit, so I could be absolutely sure the same dialogue, word for word, might occur in daily life, how the settings were checked for authenticity by social workers, how the weapon selected, as always in these shows, was a common one, readily purchasable, how the killer, myself, was shown marking himself beyond doubt as he did the job, so that anyone could see him and turn him into the law, thus ensuring that not only the victim but also the killer contributed to diminishing the total population. Despite saying this one was a stinker, Crane couldn't fault it on a single point. I felt more flattered by his silence than by any DOA rating I'd ever picked up. Towards the end, I stopped the picture where it had been when Crane interrupted me. "You'll notice what a good job the props lab does on our dummies," I said. "Even the internal organs are exact. They have to be, naturally, because in many of the shows they're exposed to the cameras. I'm very proud that making these dummies gives full employment to no less than 60 people." Crane and both girls nodded approval. Neither they nor I had to worry about adequate work, but it was impossible to avoid a stir of sympathy for those who did. "Mr. Gardner," said the girl who hadn't made the suggestion about the titles, "we notice you always use Miss Denise Delarose in your shows, and she's generally the victim. Wouldn't it be a good idea to change the victim sometimes?" I gave her a sharp look. The suggestion wasn't a serious one, for sure. I put it down to wanting to say something after her sister had done so, and to plain, ordinary jealousy. Put these two, attractive as they were, in the same room with Denise, and they practically disappeared from sight. "We do change the victim," I pointed out curtly. "In one show out of every 4, there's a multiple killing, and also in one show out of 4, the victim is a man. I've even played the victim's role myself on occasion, though not for some months because it had a poor effect on the DOA rating. People apparently couldn't take the killing seriously if they saw the star of the show die. Besides, there's a psychological reason for making the victim a beautiful woman. The more attractive she is, the more likely she is to, I saw them begin to blush and fidget, sighed, and settled on the polite circumlocution. "The more likely she is to increase the population," I said. "So we stress pretty women as potential victims." I glanced at Crane and my heart sank. He really was in a hole-picking mood. He was going to take what the girl had said as though it were a sensible comment. "How many times has Denise played the victim in the past few months?" he rapped. I couldn't hedge on that. 12 times in the past 6 months, not counting multiple killings which included her. Harumph! If people can't take the killing seriously when the star gets killed, how can they take it seriously when the same victim crops up all the time? Well, for one thing, Denise is a magnificent actress, and we take pains to ensure that every role is as different as can be from the one before it. Fair enough. But how different from the role before that, Jean? I was sweating now. Well, we can't have too great a diversity, you know. We're always aiming at a maximal number of potential identifications, so we have to select roles from the high-density social strata and the most overpopulated classification groups. Crane grunted. "I've heard all that before," he said obstinately. "The point's still valid. Suppose you—" I saw I was going to have to dig my heels in. "No supposing," I said bluntly. "The show wouldn't have got where it is if we'd supposed and fired blind. I say stick to facts. And facts are that the rating is higher these past 6 months since Denise has been playing the opposite, me, than it's ever been before. Facts are that Denise and I inspire one another. Working with her, I really live the part. Look. I gestured at the screen and tripped the switch on the seat arm. Did you notice that check in my movements? A pang of remorse. A moment of hesitation as the killer realizes what he's done. Is that or is it not true to life? Glancing at the girl who had started the argument, I saw she wasn't willing to be convinced. Some people, mostly attractive women, don't believe attractive women can act. Denise was an exception. I set out to ram the fact home. After a quarter hour's hard selling, I'd tried every angle of attack I could think of, and I hadn't made out. Well, I just have to figure out more to use tomorrow. Of course, I could always go back to Lancaster and take the show with me. If it meant keeping Denise, I could force myself to do it. One of the girls interrupted discreetly to remind Crane of an appointment due in a few minutes. Shrugging, he got up. "Leave it as it is for the moment, Jean," he said. "Believe me, I'm not quarreling with your ability or your rating. I'm just looking for ways to jack that rating up still further, past the 1,000 maybe." Yes, it would be quite something to have the first show to hit the magic number. I gave a wan smile. I appreciate that, boss man. Still, we've come a long way already from our first rating. Remember? Well, he remembered all right. 42. In fact, after that first show, there was talk about canceling the series immediately. But Crane had faith in me, and I had to admit I owed him a lot for that. The first show was a poisoning, and the choice of that method was a mistake. The second was a straightforward stabbing with a butcher knife, and within 48 hours the rating was 100% up on the first week. 85 butcher knife victims DOA in the city area, and the third week we topped the 100 and never looked back. But I still swore it had taken Denise's arrival in the show to put it right ahead of the competition. On the point of leaving, Crane paused and turned. "Jean," he called, "what's the theme for the next show?" Spreading my hands, I grinned. "I'll sweat it out by first rehearsal tomorrow," I said. "You know how I work." "I'd like it ahead of time," he said. "I have a policy conference tomorrow at 10. The sponsors group want to put your show on the agenda. I don't know why, and I was going to object, but instead of that, let's have you sitting in on the discussion, okay?" All I could do was look delighted. Only a few of the things which I'd got out of the success of the show meant anything to me in themselves, except getting Denise, which meant everything. The car was one of the few. I really appreciated not having to fight for subway places or room on a bus anymore. Although I'd had it nearly a year now, I still had to stop and admire it for a moment every time before I got in. Long, at least 10 feet, roomy, with plenty of space for 4 adults. It was barely smaller than the boss man's own, and one of only a few thousand similar models in the city. Of course, it was attention-getting, and that had its drawbacks. Like this evening, I collected my regular passengers from the Transport Coordination Depot, 2 young men who worked in the public relations section and lived a short distance beyond my home, drove out of the building and hooked on the end of a chain going to the intersection of Plain and 15th. "Picking up Denise," I explained to the passengers. They didn't raise any objection. The detour would only take an hour or so, and after all, it was my car, not theirs. At first, we got along quite quickly, the speedo hitting as high as 12 miles per hour. Then, at the usual jam around Plain and 10th, we slowed to a crawl. On the packed sidewalk, someone noticed that the seat beside me was empty. He came over and rapped on the window. Of course, I couldn't hear what he said, the car being soundproof, but other people could, other loafers idling around on the sidewalk. Within a few seconds, a fair crowd had gathered, 900 to 1,000, I judged. I could tell from their contorted faces that they were being worked up to a fever pitch by the man who had started the trouble. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that my passenger's lips were moving nervously. There was no real call to worry, I was sure. Once the crowd began to interfere with traffic, the police would show in seconds, which they did. A few bursts from an automatic weapon put the pedestrians back where they belonged, apart from about half a dozen who got trampled in the rush, and the original troublemaker who stood his ground obstinately, yelling at the police and pointing at me. I rolled down the window as an officer approached. He recognized me, naturally, and as soon as I'd explained that the seat was empty because I was picking up Denise, he apologized, shot the troublemaker, and got back aboard his copter. So, in spite of the fuss, I was only a few minutes late at my rendezvous with Denise. I had no idea where she'd been all day. Shopping, perhaps. She could afford to shop occasionally now, and I wasn't going to rest till she could do it at least once a week. If she had been shopping, she'd found a bargain, that was for sure. Her eyes were sparkling, and the way she kissed me on getting in the car told me she was on top of the world. In fact, we'd rolled a dozen blocks before I realized we ought to have hooked on somewhere else by now and turned towards home. Laughing, I made her hold back the big news till I'd sorted the problem out, and then gave her my best camera smile. "What's with you?" I demanded. "I haven't seen you in such a state since we got married." "Well, then that's your fault," she teased me. "And so's this. So we're even. Isn't it wonderful? The clinic says definitely yes." "What?" I said, and felt as though I'd suddenly gone hollow clear through. "They say yes, and it's 64 in favor of a boy. It's too early to be sure, but—" "A what?" I said. "A boy, a son. Jean, I'm so happy. Directly I was finished at the clinic, I went right next door to the maternity guidance room and got all their literature. Look, I have it here, marvelously comprehensive. And some books and some educational tapes. I put one straight in the recorder, just as a treat for myself. Listen, can't you imagine how wonderful it's going to be hearing Jean Jr. lisp through his first nursery rhymes?" She held up her recorder and pressed the on switch before I could stop her. A silly, patronizing female voice filled our half of the car with a graceless song. "What is the F on your cheek, pretty maid? My pretty maid, my pretty maid. The F stands for frigid, sir, she said. Sir, she said. Sir, she said. The F stands for frigid, sir, she said." I made to switch the nonsense off, but she put the recorder out of my reach, and remembering the passengers in the rear seat could see us, even if they couldn't hear us, I didn't try to grab. I sat there, fuming, while the second verse played to its end. "Then I can't marry you, my pretty maid, my pretty maid, my pretty maid. Nobody axed you, sir, she said. Sir, she said. Sir, she said. Chop, cherry, chop, chop, chop." "I liked that one specially," Denise said brightly, turning off the recorder. "It reminded me of last week's show." I took a deep breath. "Are you out of your mind?" I said. "Jean, you must be." In the time the tape had taken to play, I'd had the chance to get boiling mad. Now I blew off. "What in the hell do you think it's going to do to the show's DOA rating if it gets around that the stars are increasing the population, hey? Do you know what I've been doing all afternoon? I've been fighting an attempt by Bossman Crane to squeeze you out of your regular spot in the show. I thought I was on the way to winning, and you come along and tell me this and expect me to grin and bear it. Hell, do you think you'll be able to hide the state you'll be in a few months from now? And even if you could, what's the point of trying if you've been stupid enough to go to a clinic instead of finding out the name of a reliable and discreet MD? Those places are hotbeds of gossip, and it'll take a week to kill the rumors that have started already. I'm damned certain of that, Denise. I switched to a pleading note. Denise, are you completely insane? She was staring at me frozen-faced. I recognized her unjustly accused expression. It figured 2 shows out of 4 on a fair average. Jean, you're the one that's crazy. Either that or so unnatural I don't believe it. A man who hears he's due to be a father is supposed to be pleased, not suppose, I raged. I spent the afternoon telling Crane not to suppose things. Now you're doing it. 480,000 the population's gone up lately in this city alone. God knows what the figure is for the whole country. And here we are priding ourselves on a DOA rating that's doing something to stop the rot. And you let yourself get pregnant. I buried my head in my hands. Doesn't the show mean anything to you? Don't you care about the purpose it serves? The show's fiction, she countered, but a quaver in her voice indicated I'd made a dent in her abnormal mood. I hurried to make it a crack. Fiction? Why, only a few minutes back a sidewalk loafer practically started a riot because the seat where you're sitting was empty and he was on foot. The police had to turn out and 6 people got trampled. Fiction? Fiction, hell. The show exists for a purpose. It's one of the things helping to make the world a fit place again. I believe in that show and the good it does. If I didn't, I couldn't have built it and you up to the top rating it has now. It's a hell of a sight more than just fiction. Hear me? She turned in her seat and stared through the windshield at the train of cars ahead. I'd seen this look of withdrawal before, too, on dozens of shows. That didn't stop me being hurt by it. I had a moment of mental struggle, then I put my hand on hers, finding it curiously limp and cold. "I'm sorry, darling," I said. I blew my top. She didn't give any sign that she heard me. I went on. "Look, if you think it over, you'll come to see I'm right. We can get things fixed, and I'll see that the news is publicized enough to kill any rumors that got started this afternoon, and tell you what, how long would this damned thing have taken to arrive? 9 months, isn't it?" Her pale lips barely moved. 8 now, she whispered. "It's a good long time. By then, believe it or not, at the rate things are developing, we should pass the 1,000 mark. 1,000 DOAs out of one show. Isn't it wonderful? I'll milk the sponsors of a bonus for that, and we'll have the most terrific celebration, and you'll be able to forget that I ever made you unhappy. I really am sorry, darling, but you gave me a terrible shock, you know? You made me very afraid and miserable for a moment there." I'd assumed it was just a mood. Denise got these fits of the blues sometimes when the apartment got her down because, after all, it wasn't as big as it could have been, or when too many people recognized her on the street and she had to be rescued before she was mobbed. Me, I was adjusted to that. The more often I was recognized, the better for my morale. Only this was pretty long-lasting for a blue mood, and she'd picked a hell of an evening to stage it, too. First rehearsal due tomorrow at 15 hours, and by then I had to have the plot of the week's show cut and dried so we could script and select props and get the scenery into production ready for recording next day. I couldn't turn on my creative faculties with Denise mooning about the way she was, and I'd got to. Absolutely got to. If I didn't show with a dilly of an idea when the policy conference met at 10, I wouldn't be able to scotch this notion of replacing Denise, though I wasn't as fierce about the proposal as I had been earlier. I tried changing the subject. I tried appealing to her in so many words to come off her high horse. I tried putting suggestions for the show to her for her opinion. She just went on moping. At 21 hours, I gave up, dropped into my viewing in the middle of the apartment, and tried to cajole her into sitting on my knee to watch the competition's best-rated show the way we usually did together. She wasn't having that either. She pulled a face and sat down on the divan behind me. So, the hell with it. I wasn't going to pass up the rival show to accommodate her tantrums. I switched on just in time to catch the intro music and the titles. Lancaster's big DOA show was quite different from mine. It relied on guest stars, which I'd always said was wrong. How could you expect the viewers to identify if they saw people on their wall-to-walls they'd seen already in scores of widely differing roles? Nonetheless, the Lancaster team sometimes came up with a good idea, and to add to my depression tonight was one of their better nights. The main character was a janitor living in what used to be the elevator car of a big apartment building. He was presented as a socially well-adjusted type. One of the 50-odd people living on the 12th floor was a pretty girl he'd fallen for, but because he was afraid he might lose control of himself if he struck up an acquaintance with her, and maybe get her in private and run the risk of increasing the already unbearable population density in the block, he'd never even spoke to her. Then a heel living on the floor below this girl started to hang around her, and the janitor was appalled to find that she, whom he'd pictured to himself as decently frigid, was letting him make time with her. He brooded and kept watch till he was sure beyond doubt. Then, heavy-hearted, he went into action. On the landing, at the foot of the stairway between the 12th floor where the girl lived and the 11th where the heel lived, was a man-high window coming almost to the floor, which used to give on the fire escape before it was taken away under the municipal ordinance a few years back. He freed the catch on this window and oiled the hinges so it swung easily. Then he got some grease and smeared it all over the stairs. The gimmick, naturally, was that when the heel came back to his own floor after being with the girl, he'd slip and go straight out the window to smash on the sidewalk 11 floors below. Ingenious. And the shots of the stairway were very atmospheric. Then there was a good comic sequence as the janitor waited to see his rival come out, only just about everyone else on the 12th floor beat him to it. A gang of kids, then a fat woman with a huge ration bag indicating a big family, then a couple of men a few moments apart. And the way the camera caught the look on the janitor's face as he patiently pulled the window to after each failure and slopped more grease on the stairs was as fine a job as I'd seen in years. My envy began to get lost in honest professional admiration round about the 4th time an unwanted victim skidded on the stairs and went looping out the window. This was very well done, except for the music, which seemed incongruous. The music? I snapped around in my viewing chair. Sure enough, the music didn't belong with the show at all. Denise was playing that damned tape again, the one I'd heard in the car. "Nobody axed you, sir," she said. "Sir," she said. "Sir," she said. "Chop, cherry, chop, chop, chop." "Denise," I said politely, "I'm viewing. Please turn that off." She said no attention. I sighed, got up, and took the recorder from her limp grasp. I dropped the tape cassette in the waste disposal tube, patted her cheek, and returned to my chair just in time to catch the climax. The girl and the heel emerged from the girl's room together, arms around each other, smiling, and duly lost their footing on the greasy stairs. Together they went diving through the window, the heel revealing his true nature as he tried to save himself at the girl's expense. Cut to the janitor's ludicrous expression as he realized his plan had worked too well. So that left him to get his comeuppance. It came as he leaned out to pull the window closed. He leaned too far, overbalanced, and over a last shot of the swinging window the credits came up. I bit my lip. The only flaw in the whole thing was that a careless viewer might have taken the janitor's demise as voluntary, and suicide was against the production code. It wasn't enough of a fault to signify. The beautifully generalized setting was bound to ensure a surge of people breaking their necks on greased stairways in the next couple of days, and that meant a big boost to the Lancaster show's DOA rating. Damn them! I'd been struggling to work out a show involving a janitor for months, and the best I'd been able to do called for arson, which was out of the question. If a fire broke out spontaneously, it was acceptable to take advantage of it, by not having fire escapes, for example. But living accommodation was far too scarce for me to be able to build a show around a deliberately started fire. I turned to Denise. "Were you watching, honey?" I inquired. "You see the kind of talent we're up against, and why we dare not let anything happen which would harm the show?" She didn't answer. She didn't say anything else all evening. My head felt apt to crack open next morning. I was in a hell of a state when I arrived early at the studios. The way Denise was behaving had prevented me from concentrating at all, and yet somehow I had to dream up a better situation than the one Lancaster had used last night, by 10 o'clock, when the policy conference met. More than once, when I was blocked, I'd found inspiration in going through the prop labs and storerooms. Starved of any other idea, that was where I went. I was usually on good terms with the 60 technicians in the lab, who weekly turned out the dummies for the show. So incredibly lifelike they could do everything bar, walk, and talk. But this morning, directly I came into the lab, I felt veiled hostility in the air. No, not so much hostility as a lack of the ordinary respect. Something in that man's smile, which could have been a sneer if it were more pronounced, and instead of a big smile and a cheery greeting from the girl who styled the dummy's hair, a mere nod. I told myself I was on edge, and my feeling was elusive. It wasn't till I'd reached the stockroom and met the props chief, Al Baisley, that I discovered it wasn't just my imagination. On catching sight of me, his long face lit with an expression I couldn't make out. Almost he looked relieved to see me. He didn't say why, though. His only words were, "Morning, Gene. What can we do for you this early in the day?" "Looking for an idea, as usual," I'd answered. "I'd like to go through the weapons section." He nodded and fell in beside me in silence as I ambled among the racks in the stockroom. Most of the racks here held weapons, cutlasses, rapiers, knives of every kind, guns from muskets to hunting rifles to pistols to submachine guns. There were cases with bottles of poison, surgical instruments, scissors, shears, models of agricultural implements. In short, everything deadly from cars to cyanide. There were little labels on most of the items in half a dozen colors. Blue indicated that we'd used them in the show already. Red and the remaining colors indicated that such items had been used by Lancaster and other competing networks. I was depressed to see how many Lancaster red labels there were. I stopped in front of a rack on which lay a sleek, deadly-looking firearm I didn't recognize. "New acquisition, Al?" I demanded. He came back from a preoccupied trance and lifted the gun from its rack, nodding. He handed it to me so I could feel how snugly it fitted the user's grip. "Pretty rare weapon, that," he said with pride. 40-shot carbine. I heard of its existence a year ago, but I only got hold of it last week. That's the magazine alongside the stock, see? And the single to rapid control is here where you can touch it with your trigger finger. Notice how light and easy it snicks over? The whole thing's in impeccable condition." It was certainly a keen weapon. "You have shells?" I asked. "Case of 120 that came with the gun, 3 full loadings. Say, Gene, this is a hell of a thing to have to ask a friend, but—" A sort of icy block formed around my heart. I knew what was coming even before I'd said heartily, "Go ahead, Al. Ask me anything you like. You know I don't offend easily." "Well, there's a peculiar rumor going around about Denise." He swallowed and cocked his head on one side. "Such as?" I encouraged. "Damn the scandalmongers at the clinic. Whatever happened to so-called medical ethics?" "People are saying she's, due to add to the population. She and you, naturally." "Oh, that," I said scornfully. "My God, Al, I wish our DOA rating would grow as fast as rumors do. Like all rumors, this one's built on a grain of truth, granted, but accidents can happen to anybody." "Accident?" echoed Al doubtfully. "Pure accident," I emphasized. "And of course, there are ways to fix such accidents, which we'll be doing forthwith. Neither of us is crazy enough to jeopardize the show." Unexpectedly, he put out his hand. "I sure am glad to hear you say that, Gene," he exclaimed. "Look, in absolute confidence, I've had the same kind of trouble. My wife's been arguing with me all the past month because I want her to fix another, accident. Look, she's a tremendous admirer of yours. Would you let me tell her what you've just told me? Then I'm sure I'll be able to persuade her." I didn't fancy letting the word get about till I'd had an okay from public relations on the phrasing of it. Still, Al was an old friend. I nodded permission. "I guess it's in the public interest," I said. At 10, I had to go to the policy conference, and I still hadn't had an inspiration for the week's show. I sweated all the way to the conference room, wondering about hit-and-run drivers, people starting riots in which others got trampled, and a score of themes beside, all perfectly acceptable but far too expensive. It took 12 hours to get a camera crew to and from a location outside the city and far enough distant to ensure that lens mugs didn't ruin the effect. So I was limited to 2 location shows per year. No, it had to be a studio job. Oh, I was definitely in for a bad time. Big as the room was, it was crowded, and I sat knee to knee with Crane on his side of the table. Behind him were his 2 secretaries, identical smug smiles on their faces. I gave them a dirty look as I entered, for the sake of whichever of them had suggested ousting Denise. I was sure Crane had seen the Lancaster show last night. I knew from the glower he maintained unbroken. Across the table, the expressions weren't dirty, they were just tough. On the left was the sponsors group spokesman, Mabry of Monopoly Manufacturers Incorporated. Next to him was Jackson Weems, representing the government and the Commission on Communications. And at the right, stony-faced, wearing the black robes of the Order of Spiritual Sanctimony, was Brother Louis Graveman, advisor on morality for the network. Much to my astonishment, he gave me a stony smile and a nod as I sat down. He wasn't in the habit of doing that very often. Each of these 3 also had a secretary with him. As Crane cleared his throat to begin the meeting, 5 clicks indicated the switching on of recorders. Crane explained why I'd been invited to sit in and asked if there were objections to my being present throughout the part of the agenda which wasn't concerned with my show. I hoped there would be to give me another thinking space, but nobody minded, so we went ahead. Minor problems took up the first half hour. Brother Louis had viewer complaints on moral grounds about a commercial for one of Mabry's products, and a suitable modification was agreed. Then Weems raised the problem of leisure time shifters and broached a scheme to provide government-assisted viewing centers for people who couldn't get home owing to transport difficulties. Naturally, Mabry, whose company made home wall-to-walls among all its other products, objected. Schemes like this were always coming up, and people like Mabry were always saying it wasn't a question of improved viewing facilities. It was a matter of better transportation, and people like Weems were always taking this as an insult, and the inevitable result was deadlock. It was deadlock now. I let my mind wander until they got on to news coverage. Then I pricked my ears up. It was just possible a topical theme might present itself. Weems had an axe to grind on this subject, and soon he was blasting at Mabry for all he was worth. There had been a promising outbreak of virus plague a few weeks before, which I remembered hearing about. "And what happened?" barked Weems. "The news bulletins were crammed with pictures of pitiable, fever-ridden children instead of hopeful-looking census officers. As a direct result, I tell you a direct result, before the casualty list had even hit 10,001 of your drug companies was marketing a specific. Where are we now? Back where we started. It hasn't taken a single life for more than 10 days. Mabry looked uncomfortable. He didn't answer the attack directly, but appealed to Brother Lewis. "Isn't it a moral duty to fulfill a need when it arises? We had the drug, and there was a demand for it. Were we wrong to meet the demand?" Brother Lewis shrugged. "The question is the knotty one of ends and means," he said oracularly. Should the next show concern someone deliberately spreading an infectious disease? Out of the question. Lancaster would be able to challenge every single DOA credited to us. Mabry flared up. It was easy in the crowded room, for the temperature was rising to an uncomfortable level. "Ends and means. Thunder, Brother Lewis, if all you want is a means. You know as well as I do that we've had it for years." Unexpectedly, Weems supported him. "We could create an unstoppable disease tomorrow, for example, if it wasn't for mealy-mouthed opposition from people who are too selfish to make their own contribution to the general good." After my row with Denise last night, I reflected, I certainly couldn't be accused for lack of personal involvement. "That's not what I'm talking about," Mabry snapped. "As Brother Lewis very well knows, I'm talking about Steriline, which we've had for a decade and which we aren't allowed to advertise. That's the means we need, and it's a hell of a sight more infallible than any of your stiff-necked, unctuous—" Red rag to a bull. I winced and wished that someone had objected to my staying for the whole conference. Now we could be sure of a long lecture from Brother Lewis on our bounden duty to provide people to carry their appointed crosses. We got it, pouring forth as hot as steel from a newly tapped furnace. According to Brother Lewis, the use of drugs like Steriline was morally no better than reducing the population with nuclear bombs. Even Mabry began to quiver after a while. I was a customer for Steriline, of course, and had been since marrying Denise, and I felt strongly opposed to all that Brother Lewis was saying, but if I'd been a practicing member of any order, I'd have been on my knees crying before Brother Lewis finished. He resumed his place with the air of one who has spoken fearlessly for the right, and there was an uncomfortable silence. "I think," Crane ventured, "that we might leave this, delicate topic and proceed with the agenda." A vigorous nod from Weems, a nod and scowl from Mabry, a lordly gesture of permission from Brother Lewis. Their eyes turned simultaneously on me. Matter of interest. If Mabry was now making claims that Steriline was infallible, then how? But Crane was charging ahead. "The sponsors group has asked for a discussion of Mr. Gene Gardner's show today." We support the request," Weems spoke up. "Although the shows of which Mr. Gardner's is an example perform a valuable public service, we're anxious to see their contribution increase in ratio with the gravity of the problem, and at present this is not the case. Since Mr. Gardner's show is the outstanding one of its kind, we feel it's a good place to begin our inquiry." That sounded ominous. I gave Weems a sunny smile. "Our interest is parallel," Mabry said. "We view with alarm the fact that Lancaster's top show, though still getting a lower DOA rating, is actually increasing its rating more rapidly than ours, and will probably overtake us in another few months." The smile I gave him was much less sunny. "We're fully aware of this problem," Crane declared hastily. "In fact, Mr. Gardner and I spent a long time yesterday afternoon discussing that very point." "And did you come up with any fresh ideas?" Mabry said. "Well, we considered—" Crane leaned back in his chair so that one of the twin secretaries could whisper in his ear, and went on. "We considered some extra punch in the main titles, and—" "Ha!" Mabry exclaimed. "That's no good. I was watching Lancaster's show last night and was tremendously impressed. It had everything the Gardner shows used to have: freshness, originality, light relief, superb atmosphere. Frankly, it's my belief that after Gardner's meteoric rise, he's now letting his curve flatten out." "There hasn't been any sign of that," I snapped. "There has," Mabry contradicted. "Our surveys of viewer reactions show that there's a growing lack of identification due to the recurrent appearances—" "I know what you're going to say," Crane cut in eagerly. "Blast him for a bootlicking bastard. The too frequent appearances of Denise Delarose as the victim. I made this very point to Jean yesterday." They looked at me. I was tempted to say what was really on my mind, that if anyone attempted to squeeze my favorite partner from the show, I'd go to Lancaster and take the show with me. Fortunately, I hesitated long enough for Brother Lewis to stir and give me a look by his standards almost benign. "As it happens, I too saw the Lancaster show last night," he said, "and I can't share your enthusiasm entirely. Granted, the self-control exercised by the main character was admirable, but the conclusion undermined the impact. One was left in two minds as to whether the janitor's demise might not have been voluntary, and suicide is against the code. This is a fault I've never observed in any show of Mr. Gardner's." So that was why he'd smiled when I came in. I looked properly appreciative of his support. "True enough," Mabry conceded, "but it's not the past I'm concerned with. I want to know the future plans for the show. I want to know how Gardner proposes to stay ahead of the Lancaster show." Now I was really on the spot. I wouldn't dare generalize. I was going to have to be precise and optimistic and all the other things I didn't feel. I licked my lips and hesitated, and then, as though someone had tripped a switch in my brain, the inspiration came. Words lined up on my tongue ready to be spoken. I hid my relief with a grin. "Both you gentlemen," I addressed Mabry and Weems, "want to see my DOA rating rise. So do I. What's the crucial factor on which the rating depends? It's viewer identification, obviously, right? Up to now, we've needed to concentrate on expanding our audience. In other words, we've ensured good ratings by ensuring that we had a large number of viewers. We've achieved this by making our settings and characters as typical and as average as we can. The highest density of population in a given social stratum, the most overfilled classification groups. These have been our starting points. Now the time is ripe to switch the emphasis. We have our assured audience, our millions of viewers who won't miss the show if they can avoid it. From here on, we have to emphasize the universality of our situations rather than of our characters, and we'll combine this with an appeal to the audience's aspirations. Let's take the show we're going to rehearse today and record tomorrow. My role is that of a socially adjusted man, more prosperous than the average, fortunate enough to have an apartment for himself and his wife, who sublimates his baser instincts by collecting firearms. You'll see this is psychologically consistent, of course. Likewise, it's got assured public appeal, combining the social virtues with the lure of luxury. How many people don't cherish a secret wish that they could indulge a hobby such as collecting guns? But his wife, a role which will of course be taken by Denise Delarose because it's been created with her in mind, uses all her powers of seduction to break down his self-control, and succeeds, with the appalling result that she becomes pregnant. I glanced at Brother Lewis. His eyes were gleaming. "The eternal theme!" he exclaimed. "Woman as the vessel of evil! Mr. Gardner, your inspiration amazes me. Is this man to suffer the rest of his life because he once yielded to temptation? That seems too harsh a fate. Yet the situation develops so that this consequence seems inevitable. At last, in unutterable despair, he does the only possible thing and ends his wife's life before surrendering, with a confession on his lips to the forces of law and order. And here's the angle which will put us way ahead of the Lancaster show. We're through with people just like us. We're building from now on around people who are the way we'd like to be if we were rich enough and lucky enough. And still, we're putting them in predicaments which could happen to anyone." "Gene, it's the greatest," Crane said with honest admiration, and I saw from the expressions on the faces across the table that I'd impressed the others too. It cost me all my willpower to stop myself wiping the sweat from my face and betraying how I felt. When Denise came to the studios, pale, walking as if in a dream, half an hour before rehearsal time that afternoon, I broke off my discussion with Al Baisley about the weapons collection we were going to give the killer in the show, and dashed over to throw my arms around her. "Darling, everything's wonderful. Thanks to you, I've had the most fabulous idea for this week's show. It's going to be the start of a whole new approach. And there won't be any more talk about taking you out of the show, believe me." She pushed me away without force. "I wouldn't have minded," she said, "if it was going to help." I put my arm around her waist and led her unresisting over to Al. "Silly," I teased. "I'd have minded, and I'm sure the viewers would have minded too. Al, show Denise the carbine we're going to use." Al grinned and went to fetch the gun. "I'm even glad you had that blue mood yesterday," I enthused to Denise. "It's certainly paid off. Listen, what do you think of this?" I outlined the story. When Al brought the gun, I even began to improvise movements and dialogue so that the idea took definitive shape ahead of rehearsal time. The one thing wrong was Denise's reaction. I'd expected her to feel the theme the way I did, on a personal level, but all she said was, "Very good, Gene. It'll be a big success." Al drew me aside, looking worried. "Gene, is something wrong?" he whispered. "A bit of artistic temperament is all," I bluffed. "By the time we've been through the motions, she'll catch fire like everyone else. I'm sure this one's going to be terrific all round." Then the costumes and hairstyle people came into the rehearsal studio, and the script team with their files of word and phrase frequencies, and the cameramen I always used, Hank and Sammy. It was time to get down to business. While we were discussing the shape of the story, the lab team came up as usual with the dummy and set it in a chair next to Denise so that it too could be coiffed and costumed. Much sooner than usual, things were ready for a run-through. I choked off a flow of compliments from the script team psychologist about the choice of gun collecting as a hobby for my killer and turned to call Denise. And stopped, shocked beyond measure. Because, for a second, I genuinely could not tell which was Denise and which was the dummy in those two identical chairs. Then, of course, I realized Denise was wearing the outfit I'd seen her arrive in, and the dummy was in a studio dress. The shock passed, but it left a mark. I'd been wrong to assume that once she got into the swing of things, Denise would turn in her usual fine performance. She was so lifeless it killed the enthusiasm I'd built up among the crew. After 5 abortive shots at the opening established scenes, I was fuming behind a calm face. "Take 5!" I shouted to the crew and closed my hand on Denise's wrist to draw her out of sight behind some sets which had been used for another rehearsal earlier in the day. "Denise!" I hissed. "What's eating you? I might as well be playing opposite one of the lab dummies. Come to life, will you? Damn it, this theme is straight out of your own experience." A spark of anger showed. Good. I was breaking through. "Then use a dummy," she snapped. "What's the difference?" "I certainly can't see any in what you've done so far today," I retorted. "All right, let's try again. And this time, for pity's sake, try and show you mean it." It went a little better from then on. We worked out as far as the point where the idea of seduction crossed the wife's mind. I was going to have my back to her, studying the 40-shot carbine, which was the pride and joy of my firearms collection. Suddenly, I heard her humming a tune. The same damned tune. "Nobody asked you, sir," she said. I spun around. "Denise!" I exploded. She met my gaze with all the innocence in the world. "But isn't that a good idea?" she said. "After all, I'm supposed to be thinking wicked thoughts about getting myself pregnant. Isn't a nursery rhyme appropriate?" "I think it's an excellent touch, Miss Delarose," called the psychologist on the script team, and his colleagues gave approving nods. I smiled at Denise. "Good to see you back on form," I exclaimed. The full rehearsal text next morning was done under the cameras exactly as the final recording would be done in the afternoon. Denise seemed quite her usual self. I joked with her, pointing to the dummy in its chair at the side of the studio, and told her about my shock of the previous afternoon. A teasing smile came to her beautiful lips. "If you're my husband and you can't tell me from a dummy, who else could?" she demanded. "I can certainly tell you apart in private," I answered and tried to kiss her. She held me off. "You're supposed to be playing a socially responsible person, remember?" I grinned and gave in. We usually shot these shows with 2 cameras, one trucking and one on a blimp. There was a master screen over the goldfish bowl, which showed whatever was on camera at the moment. Hank was with the blimp as usual. I took every chance I got when I was out of shot to glance at the master screen and imagine how it would look. It was promising. Denise seemed to have lost her bad mood completely, and by the time we were up to the point of the actual killing, she was heart and soul in her part. Some of the looks of hatred she shot at me were so violent they almost made me stumble in my lines. By recording time, the show was close to perfection. The dummy waited in its chair, with the lab team making adjustments all the time, so when the climax arrived and I shot Denise down with the carbine, nobody could possibly tell there had been a switch. We finalized the sequence of shots with Hank and Sammy and broke for lunch. All through the meal, I kept congratulating Denise over and over for giving me the idea, for recovering from her depression, for turning in such a natural performance. She listened absently. I took it she was preoccupied with thoughts about the show. When we came back from the canteen, Al Baisley was waiting in the studio. With him was a small woman, rather plain, with a round face and a nervous manner, whom I hadn't seen around here before. "Can I have a word with you, Jean?" Al said, coming up. I nodded and drew aside from Denise, who didn't seem to notice. "Look, Jean," Al went on, "you remember what I said about my wife? Well, she wasn't having any. She thought I was making it up, so I, arranged for her to come down and meet you and Denise and get it straight from you. I hope you don't mind." I thought it was a bit high-handed not to have asked me before bringing his wife along. Still, I couldn't very well refuse. I said brightly, "Sure, let me explain it to Denise first, though, and make sure she has no objections." "You're a pal, Gene," he said, looking relieved. I caught up with Denise. She was standing before the dummy's chair, studying her duplicate with great concentration. I put Al's problem to her. Her face lit up. "I'd be delighted," she said, in the warmest tone I'd heard from her all day. "Are you certain? It's none of my doing. I promise you, the rumors must have got to Al from the clinic, and since by sheer coincidence he has the same trouble he asked, it's perfectly clear," she answered impatiently. "Is that his wife standing next to him?" "Gene," Al called out, "look who's coming into the goldfish bowl." I looked. There was Crane, and he was no surprise. He often came to rehearsals or recordings, but with him were brother Louis Graveman, Jackson Weems, and Mabry. "Hell," I said under my breath, at the same time pulling on a welcoming smile. I'd hoped to, supervise the talk between Denise and Mrs. Baisley. No chance now. I went into the goldfish bowl and shook hands all around. Crane explained, "We were all so interested in your new plans for the show, we decided we'd like to attend the actual performance, as it were." "I'm flattered," I said with all the enthusiasm I could muster. I gave them a quick rundown on what they could see on the studio floor, but that wasn't what they were after. At length, Mabry cleared his throat. "I hear you insist on realism in your shows. Isn't that so? I mean, you use an actual knife or an actual gun, not studio dummies." "That's correct," I agreed. "You might not think the viewer could tell the difference, but it creates a different atmosphere and gets me deeper into my role." "I'd be extremely interested to see the weapon you're using this week," Mabry pursued. Crane butted in before I could stop him. "Our props man is out there on the floor talking to Miss Delarose. I'll have him fetch the gun for you." Which he did. Al and I had to show all the fine points of the weapon to these greedy sensation seekers. It was at least 10 minutes before I could decently remark that we were holding up the show. I'd been keeping my eye on Denise and Mrs. Baisley. They were deep in conversation, but the goldfish bowl was soundproof, and no mics were live, so I could only guess what they were saying. At one point, I saw Denise point to the dummy waiting in its chair, and Mrs. Baisley glanced from her to it and threw up her hands in amazement. I hoped very hard that Denise was telling the other woman what Al wanted her to hear. It seemed things had gone all right in the end, for when Mrs. Baisley parted from Denise, I saw a calm, resolute expression on her round, nervous face. Maybe she was resigned to doing the sensible thing, as Denise appeared to be. She played the whole opening section of the show with real conviction and intensity. The only retake which was necessary was my fault. I fumbled while handling a gun from the collection Al had set up for me on the wall of the set. Even that irritating nursery rhyme, which had set my nerves on edge at rehearsal, seemed to fit into the pattern of the story exactly as Denise had suggested. Inexorably, events followed one another. The wife's decision to break down her husband's self-control, the seduction, the consequences, the husband's horror and despair, the wife's refusal to see reason, her glorying in what she had done. Mentally, I tensed as we approached the climax, the moment when we froze, cut the cameras, and had the dummy exchanged for Denise. As usual, Al watched from the side of the floor rather than from the goldfish bowl. His wife sat meekly next to him. Once or twice I glanced at her for a reaction. After all, she was as close to an average viewer as I'd ever had present at a recording, and I was satisfied to read the emotion in her face. Climax! I picked up the carbine. As though driven by intolerable compulsion, and turned slowly to Denise, who saw my purpose in my eyes and fell back into a chair, her mouth opening in a wordless scream. As usual, Hank's camera was covering this crucial shot because he had a fantastic visual memory and would remain glued to his viewfinder until the dummy had been posed so exactly no one could tell there had been a switch at all. "Cut," I said, relaxing. At once, the lab crew picked up the dummy. Denise got slowly out of her chair, and I went to grin at Crane in the goldfish bowl and receive nods of approval from the VIP guests. I always moved around instead of trying to hold the pose while the dummy was set up. I found it easy to resume and interrupted movement. I'd had a lot of experience, of course. Suddenly, there was a shrill scream of horror, and everyone, including me, whirled to look for the source. Mrs. Baisley was flinging up her arms and yelling, and in a moment had collapsed to the floor. People dashed to see what the matter was. I took charge and made them stand back. Al went on his knees at her side, calling her name. "Veronica! Veronica!" Then, of course, Crane and his companions had to add to the crowd, and things were completely out of hand for a full 3 minutes. In the end, I had a couple of the script team carry her out of the studio to a restroom along the corridor. Al went with them. A few moments later, however, he was back, looking relieved. "She'll be okay," he said. "I'm terribly sorry. She says she was so startled at seeing how much the dummy looked like Denise that she was frightened." I was going to give him a piece of my mind when there came an acid growl from Hank. "If you don't calm down and get back to business, Gene will forget his pose." "The hell you say?" I answered good-humoredly. "But you're quite right. Quiet, everyone. Back to the job." The studio settled back to normal. Hank made ready to continue the recording. I picked up my gun and fell back in my pose, and Crane herded the visitors back in the goldfish bowl. Just before signaling Hank to proceed, I glanced at Denise sitting in the chair the dummy had been in before. I felt a qualm. It was small wonder, really, that Mrs. Baisley had managed to scare herself. The lab had made a fantastic job of the resemblance, especially since Denise was watching me with unblinking concentration. From the way my sample average viewer had reacted, this show was sure of a good rating. I had just finished raising the gun to firing position. I went through the build-up movement again, heard Hank click the camera switch. I froze my face into a mask of demon-driven resolve, sighted on the dummy's breast over its heart. You could have heard a pin drop. A firing pin, maybe. My view, full of the staring, open-eyed, open-mouthed face, I squeezed the trigger. The explosion was incredibly loud. Even though I'd fired the gun during rehearsal and discovered it was as recoilless as the markers claimed, I felt jolted. A 9mm hole appeared in the dummy. Blood began to ooze around it. Slowly, as though realizing too late what I'd actually done, I lowered the carbine and began to shake. And the dummy smiled. It was a triumphant smile, close to a leer. It lasted only a few seconds. Then the eyelids drifted down over the magnificent eyes as they dulled. In death. I didn't go on with the rehearsed movements. I turned and looked at the dummy sitting in the chair at the side of the floor. I looked back at Denise, whom I had just shot dead. I thought of a great many things in a short space of time. How Denise had talked with Veronica Baisley, how then she had staged her faint at exactly the moment when Denise could have brought the dummy back from its new purpose and resumed her own. She could resume poses as well as I could. I thought of the realism I was so proud of. If I fired a gun in the show, I fired a gun. A real corpse was only logical. Fair enough, fair enough. But if Hank hadn't been distracted like everyone else by the mock-fainting woman, he'd have seen Denise changing places with the dummy. He should have stuck to his job. I raised the gun and shot Hank neatly through the neck. He gave a strangled cry of amazement and fell forward, dragging his camera around so that the master screen swam with crazy panned images. "Gene!" Al Baisley shouted. "Gene!" Steriline was supposed to be infallible. That meant that Denise must deliberately have stopped taking it. By implication, Al's wife would have done the same, and he let her come to the studio, today of all days. Poor Al. I shot him about where I had shot Denise, near the heart. Behind the window of the Goldfish Bowl, I could see Crane, and the VIPs and the technicians, petrified with terror and disbelief. I could also see them above themselves. In dying, Hank had swiveled his camera around until it was focused on them. Al had been perfectly right. The single-to-rapid control could be adjusted by a mere touch. Next time I squeezed the trigger, the carbine sewed a line of holes all across the window of the Goldfish Bowl. Watching in the master screen, I saw Crane shot in the face, Brother Louis Graveman, who was taller, in the throat, Mabry, shorter, in the face again, and Weems, who was trying to get out of the door, in the back of the head. A second burst disposed of the technicians. Of course, Al had put the full 40 shots into the magazine. Realism. Then I shot Sammy, the other cameraman, as he tried to hide in a corner, and went to turn Hank's camera off before going in search of Veronica Baisley. The show topped the 1,000 that week for the first time. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.